want to talk now a bit about homelessness. And Suella Braverman, of course, was sacked on Monday morning. That was just for sort of breakfast time on Monday morning. Apparently because of her comments on homelessness, and she said that people living in tents were exercising a lifestyle choice. Now, homelessness is something I feel personally very strongly about. I used to advise the Housing Secretary, former Housing Secretary, on homelessness, and I'm actually, just to declare an interest and be totally transparent, as I hope I always am, I'm also director of a company called Home REIT, which provides accommodation to homeless people, prison leavers and care leavers and so on. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently published estimates that 3.8 million people experienced destitution in the UK last year. Government data released last week showed the number of households in England facing homelessness and placed in temporary accommodation was up 10% from the previous year. Families often facing years in temporary accommodation. And you think this might be all right. You're talking about people in bed and breakfasts. I remember the head of Shelter, a woman called Polly Neat, who's been on this programme a number of times. She said, Peter, the babies don't learn to crawl because they're in bed and breakfast accommodation, not very often, not very nice bed and breakfast accommodation. These are often people who've done nothing wrong. They are people who have paid their taxes, they've done what they needed to do, but they are in temporary accommodation, and that is a real feeling. A quarter of households with children spend 2 to 5 years, sometimes in conditions which violate their rights. Well, Pastor Mick Flemming is an interesting person because he is involved with Church on the Street, a charity. And he himself has been homeless. He's struggled with drug addiction. He was abused as a child as well. And I wonder just what he thinks of Suella Braverman's comments. Mick, you're very welcome to Talk TV today. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you, Peter, and thanks for having me on. Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of our viewers and listeners, Mick, that will have a lot of sympathy with what Suella Braverman is saying over migration, for example. They'll have differing views on homelessness, certainly, but as someone who works with homeless people, who's been homeless yourself, being homeless is not a lifestyle choice, is it? Or if people apparently decide not to be in accommodation and want to be, well, they don't want to be in tents, but they feel they have to be in tents, often there are a lot more thoughts around that. Maybe they've been abused, or maybe they've been attacked within shelters and so on. It's a lot more complex than it originally appears, isn't it?
It certainly is, but I think sometimes the language from the government and language even from local authorities doesn't speak a truth. It gives a false narrative to the overarching story. You know, we're seeing so many young people, you know, kind of becoming homeless now. We're seeing families that can't afford to pay the top-ups on the rent, not the rent, the top-ups that they have to pay on the rent. So they're becoming homeless. There's a fear culture now about people losing the housing. The price of the rents are going through the roof. We've got so many people who are mentally ill now on the streets, living on the streets because they don't have capacity to help themselves to get out of it. And this is a growing number. So then the streets become more dangerous. And it seems like the language that we're hearing is to blame the poor for being poor. And I'm not hearing a language that is unifying and lifting people up. And I think part of that, Peter, you know, is that sometimes it seems to be a political strategy that everything works from the top down and trickles down. But there is times and there is subject matters where investment right at the very bottom to grow from the bottom up. That kind of, even if you called it a theology, never mind a fiscal policy, you know, it's time, I think, to invest in the poor. We used to have, excuse the pun, good news for the poor. So we had an answer to help people who were struggling in society. And now we don't. It's being thrown onto charities. The government are almost blaming the poor for being poor and turning the back on it. And it's definitely, Peter, a false narrative that's being put out there.
I mean, you've been homeless yourself, Mick. Tell us a little bit about your story. We have Matthew in Manchester who's not too happy that you're on because of your background and what you've been up to previously. He says, I'm living in an idiocracy, utter madness. You should be doing a lifetime's penance for all the things that you've done, apparently. Maybe you feel you are, Mick. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah. Well, maybe I should be punished. Maybe I've been punished enough. I mean, I'm sure the gentleman or the person doesn't really know kind of much about what I've been through.
Well, tell us your story, Mick.
So my story is I was attacked. My addiction started. I was attacked and raped when I was 11 years of age, and the day after my sister dropped dead and my dad caught her, and I was a little boy, and I took my mother's painkillers. So within 24 hours, a sweet little boy had been changed and transformed.
Goodness me.
And the way I started to live my life was wrapped up in the trauma that I had, and I didn't get the support and I didn't get the help that I did. And as a result, I damaged a lot of other people along the way, including myself, including my own family. And I'm certain that I feel forgiven through my faith, but I've had to do a lot of things. I've gone out and I've gone to so many people who have hurt, and I can't fix it, but I don't live in the guilt of it, you know. And I do have a voice because I've slept on the streets, I've been through abuse, I've been beaten.
I'm so sorry what has happened to you. I'm so sorry that you went through all that. But as you say, and as you voluntarily said, you obviously harmed others in what you did. Did the police catch up with you, or what happened there?
Yeah, I've had to pay a recompense in lots of different ways.
Have you spent time in prison, or?
I have, yeah, and I've spent time in psychiatric units and lots of other institutions as well. Yeah.
Goodness me, well, what a story. What do you think the government should be doing? What sort of way should they be talking about homelessness, the kind of people you work with? How can they shift their attitude? I do think a lot of good work goes on within government, and there is a lot of money spent on it, but the manifesto pledge that the Conservatives have to stop rough sleeping, those who sleep on the street, by the next election, that's just not going to happen, is it?
No, definitely not. So I think there's two elements. I think there's homelessness and there's rough sleeping, and the two getting mixed up. So when we say homelessness, we're talking about people that don't have a home. I think counting and the figures, the figures are really erroneous as well. So therefore, the finances that go into it are wrong. They're not enough. Because if you count the number of rough sleepers, I don't know if I'm sure you know, Peter, how they count the people.
It's a controversial process, actually, even how they count them, never mind the number. Yeah.
Yes. So therefore, how do you, if you say you've got 5 rough sleepers, then you don't need much investment in that area for rough sleeping. But you're more likely to have 50 to 100 rough sleepers. They just, the way they count them.
Well, it's a very controversial thing. Well, listen, thanks for talking to us, Mick. That's Pastor Mick Flemming from the Church on the Street charity. Thank you for joining us this morning.